Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Progressive Era, a period in time where people were trying to fundamentally improve social, political, economic problems that they saw that were both created by the Gilded Age and were just inherent problems that existed within this country. So let's get started. Progressives believed fundamentally people are good, but they could be corrupted by society in and of itself. The problems that existed were not yours, they were created by institutions, larger things. And if you could fix those large problems, then the person would become better. Now, there's a big difference from where we see that can be. If you go into the South, especially the deep and even rural South, reforming and making things better usually means taking away rights for African Americans. The progressives never really had a single group. They were not a single leader. They were not a single person. The goal of them was to fight corruption, to fight inefficiency, to fight the wrongs that had come to become the norms in the world. And the first of these that we see are a series of articles from investigative journalists, and they were called muckrakers. The muckraker would be the person who digs through the crud and the filth to find what's really going on. And the first of these articles that comes out in McClure's magazine talked about how John Rockefeller had become the oil magnate and tycoon. And when the specifics of how he had done the things he had did to become so wealthy and become so powerful really came to light, people reacted with just disgust at this. And more of these articles kept coming out, talking about how labor gangsterism existed. For example, a business could hire people and make the employees live at the factory and then pay them in money that is not actual American dollars. It's something akin to monopoly money. And that was done for a long time. And when all this starts coming to light, people are realizing, my goodness, I can't believe this is all happening in this country. Jacob Riis was a photographer who used a new type of flash photography that allowed him to take pictures of the night, to take pictures of dark spaces. And he had been interested in showing people how bad it really was in the squalor, in the slums, in these places that were created by so many people coming to live. New York is the best example of these. You had so many people who swarmed into New York, immigrants, poor folk, people who wanted a factory job, people who wanted a fresh start, a new life, and they are living ridiculously poor. So Riis goes into these places and he takes pictures. He shows how crowded the slums are. He shows how crowded how terrible the living conditions are, how filthy things are. And he creates this book called How the Other Half Lives and Dies in America. And you can read a story about a business tycoon and that can say, well, that's not nice. But you see a picture of children cuddling together so they don't freeze to death. That's heartbreaking. Upton Sinclair was another one of these muckraker investigative journalists, and he exposed how filthy the meatpacking industry was in this country. You lived in a time in the early 20th century and long before that where your meat might not be what it said on the outside. Your animal that was being slaughtered, it might already be dead when it wound up at slaughter and already necrofying and decaying, and there was no problem in packaging it up and selling it to the public. Canned meat was such a public health hazard during this time that in the Spanish-American War, more people died from eating canned meat than they did fighting the Spanish on any front. And Reese and Upton Sinclair shows this and how bad these conditions are for both the worker and the people who are eating all this food. And the public is disgusted, and President Roosevelt reacts by creating the Food and Drug Administration, which still is in existence today. It regulates what qualifies good meat and bad meat. There were a lot of changes that affected a lot of different things. We see that progressive pastors, for example, felt that the moral authority that they had wielded was challenged by the fact that people wanted to have things. Your average college professor starts worrying that, no longer is the university worried about the learning process, but just how much money we can make from these students. Lawyers who had historically been aristocratic are now cogs of politics and education and economics. The middle class generally liked the idea of reform and change because they're not hugely radical. They're not hugely too big or too small. The hard times of the 1890s led people to want to go in a more radical direction, and we see a huge upswing in socialism during this time. We've talked about Debs before, but this is one of his later runs for president. On the picture at the bottom, there's him on the left, and that's him in his prison garb, the same prison uniform he had when he was arrested for standing with the Pullman strike in 1896. But people wanted to see us change so much, and they were willing to accept this, that in 1900 he gets 100,000 votes, and then 4 years later he quadruples that number. One of our new major union organizations that's going to come into existence is the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. They organized around the idea that they wanted better working conditions, they wanted a stronger economy, and they wanted a democracy that they felt was more akin to the worker and less akin to a powerful magnate. And the founder of this group was this man right here, Big Bill Haywood. Unfortunately, shortly after this group is founded and they really start moving, Haywood is charged with complicity in murder. And even though he was acquitted of the charges, it still stuck with the IWW for a long time. So even though they had these huge pushes and big goals, they were always hampered by this early incident. A lot of progressives felt that the problem of political corruption could best be tackled in the city. In a town, you know what you need to fix. The town that you are currently living in, you have an idea of what could make it better, where the problems are, where the problems lie. A small town in the middle of the Nebraska, for example, might be a little harder for someone in a small town in Texas to know how to fix. You know what can help your town. That's the idea of fixing your town. Some progressives felt that, you didn't need to tackle state legislature or even national politics. You could tackle things right in your own backyard. The first big state reform movement happened because of this man, Robert La Follette. He had been a congressman and then governor of Wisconsin, but after serving as a congressman, he comes back and he works to reform the state. And La Follette's Wisconsin idea said perfunctorily that you need to get people who are skilled in specific areas and get them to fix that thing. You need to have your railroad commissioner run by guys who know how the railroad works. You need your tax assessment office run by your tax collectors, by your accountants. You need your highway construction guy to be somebody who knows how to lay a highway. They need to be engineers. La Follette creates all new public service task force by going to the University of Wisconsin and hiring people immediately at graduation and saying, okay, you're the young, bright kid in the field. What do we do? Let's change what we've been doing and do things maybe a little different. This was ridiculously popular and grew very quickly to be adopted by lots of other states as well. Some states are going to start putting together laws for the hazardous workers. A lot of states are going to put hours on railway workers first. Minors get capped at 8 hours in Utah. Tenements, the slums that were in New York City, after Jacob Riis's picture book, they start getting torn down and they start adding basic necessities to them, like running water or maybe a toilet. Women are going to continue to struggle for a lot of state legislation. It happens, it's just much slower going for women workers exclusively. Child labor organizes much faster, though. In 1904, the National Child Labor Committee is organized, and it takes about a decade for them to ban employing young people and even limiting how many hours they can work. This goes into effect in 1914. 4 years later, in 1918, the Supreme Court case, Hammer v. Dagenhart, said this is unconstitutional. The argument was, if you wanted to work, you should be able to work. And there shouldn't be a law that says you can't work. Now, we can look at these children looking like they're in a factory or coal miners or something, and we can say, that's terrible. Why are those kids not in school? And that's because in this time frame, what you understand as school did not really exist for people. There was no public school system that existed. That is a product that came much later, and it didn't become mandatory until a decade after that. So we're a good 30, 40 years away from these kids just being in school. Lots of states are going to start setting standards for what women can do. This is 1917. And one of the first ones we see is a minimum wage law in 1923. Laws protecting women workers were put in place because the thought was, they're women, they need the extra legislation to protect them. And that was it. Henry Ford, the man who created the assembly line, made cars that were cheaper, were more affordable, and also gave the idea that manufacturing could work a lot quicker. And with a moving assembly line, you could produce a finished good much quicker. Your workers are much more specialized, and Ford even paid his folks much more than they were making anywhere else. So much so that they could actually buy their own car, $5 a day. Now, this is at a time where your average heavy industry guy is making maybe $3 a day. So that's a big bump in pay. With extra stuff, with the fact that new things are produced much quicker, much cheaper, and you're getting paid better, we see the beginning of abundance, where you can have more stuff. You have more things than what you might need, but you're definitely going to get all your wants as well. And this idea of mass consumption and mass consumerism is going to be a thing that's going to be a center place for American society for, hell, the next 100 years. We still have it. The term suffrage, just so we're clear, means the right to vote. When the federal government adopted the 14th and 15th Amendment that made universal male suffrage a thing, there was a big surprise that it was just for men, that women were not also given the right to vote. And the first big group that was pushing for this was the National Women's Suffrage Association, NWSA. And the two people who are going to be the faces and bodies and voices of this organization would be Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They were at the heart of moving women's votes forward. We also see that as the right for women's voting was going on, the right for birth control was also going on. Now, at the start of the 20th century, we see that women like Emma Goldman and Margaret Sanger were trying to just educate people on birth control. This was not the pill yet. This was not anything that could control hormones. In fact, even male prophylactics were usually a little more expensive than the average person who would be willing to pay. What these two did is they just gave information on how you could get pregnant, on what the signs of pregnancy and ovulation were. And this is the kind of stuff that prior to now was just not discussed in open conversation. Over time, we do see women are going to create some sexisms as well. That is something that is created with the women's suffrage and women movement. The idea that all women are all morally superior to all men. And that if women had the right to vote, then the very next day all politics would no longer be corrupt, and that war would immediately stop if women were allowed to vote. And that idea definitely did not happen. It would be wonderful to live in a world without corruption and needless war. Unfortunately, those things still existed and still do exist. As more and more suffragettes, women who wanted to see the vote come to pass, more and more average Americans start turning the idea that a vote for women made sense. When President Wilson stopped supporting the idea of constitutional amendment for women voting, they started picketing the White House. And they would picket with signs, many like you see here, or they would picket with signs that contradicted what the president said. And these were especially damning because the quotes that these women suffragettes used were Wilson's own words. And when they were arrested not because they were picketing the White House, that's protected by the First Amendment, or by what they hung, that's also protected by the First Amendment. They were arrested for traffic violations. And when they chose not to pay the fee, they were sentenced to a workhouse. The National Women's Suffrage Association stopped focusing on state-by-state adoptions and moved forward with a congressional approval. And an amendment did get passed in 1919, and then the states ratified this in 1920, giving women, all women who are citizens over the age of 21, the right to vote. Here's our map that you can see. We've got the states that had women's suffrage at the state level, and this is state and local level, are going to be in red. Those had the they could vote prior to the 19th century. Gold is going to be 1910 to 1914, and states that didn't have suffrage, full suffrage, are going to be, as you can see, the plurality of states there. But when you had people vote, do you want this to go forward with the 19th Amendment? Overwhelmingly, you can see people were voting yes. Our last big contribution to women and the social impact of the progressive age is Jane Addams and Hull House. She organized reformers that took on the democratic approach of progressivisms. Her Hull House allowed women who wanted to get a college education to have a place to stay and live and get started and find footing. It was developed to the idea that you were going to make an impact in the world. And it did help produce a lot of 20th century female reformers. So today we took a look at the progressive age and how it affected society. Tune in next time to how the progressive age affected politics and race. Take care. Hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.